unprepared can be catastrophic. In the months before the 9/11 attacks, American law enforcement and counterterrorism specialists saw a dramatic increase in Al-Qaeda's communication traffic that suddenly stopped. That's never a good sign. They had a sense that something big was in the offing, but they didn't have specific intelligence that told them what was going to happen. I imagine if they had, we'd live in a very different world right now. But since they didn't, they had to rely on the general level of preparedness of American society to endure such an attack. And of course, we're all familiar with the history of what happened. The attack was devastating to the United States, and it highlighted many of the places where the American civil society was not prepared for that sort of an assault. But it's not just with defense or counterterrorism or law enforcement that preparedness is important. Preparedness is also important for God's people because the day of the Lord is coming. The day of the Lord is something that we read about an awful lot in the Old Testament prophets. It's a way of understanding how a just God relates to an unjust world. How can God tolerate such injustice? The idea is that from time to time, God intervenes in human history to rebalance the scales. Sometimes it happens on a smaller level, where God intervenes to help the good guys win a battle or something like that. But Jews believed that there was going to be a capital letters Day of the Lord, in which God would intervene in human history, judge the wicked, reward the righteous, raise the righteous dead to live in a new world, a new age, in which all the old and twisted things would cease to function. That was their hope. But as God worked, it seems that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. A baby is born. And that baby brings with him the embryonic state of a new age. And as he grows up and ministers and is eventually put to death and is raised to new life, ascends to heaven and pours out the Holy Spirit, a new age is born. But that new age doesn't replace the old age, at least not right away. Rather, it runs alongside the age. And it becomes almost like a rescue boat to take people from this old thing that's dying and transfer them into this new one. And so God uses this new age inaugurated by Jesus to take people whose lives are characterized by selfishness and sin and to transform them to become people whose lives are characterized by love. And so this new community of people, the church, is born. It's a people who are meant to be a proof of concept about how God saves in concrete and real ways. Their life together is meant to be a living invitation to all others who can see them and say, "Isn't their God amazing? Don't we want some of what they have? Let's come to their God." And so we see this time of two ages. But the two-age arrangement won't last forever. When you buy a new piece of tech or when a new piece comes out, oftentimes the supplier will sell the old version for a limited time afterwards. They're just trying to get rid of the excess stock that they still have. But you know that eventually that thing's headed for discontinuity because this new one has replaced it. And so it is with us. We live in a period where you have an option. Do you want to live in this old way of living? Or do you want to become people of this age to come, living in the midst of the present age? But eventually, the day of the Lord will happen, and that old age will come to a close. Jesus warns his disciples about that. All of this is sort of background for the passage that I want to look at today. A couple weeks ago, we looked at Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple in Luke's gospel. Today, the lectionary has assigned me Matthew's gospel, where Jesus continues that conversation. Jesus starts by saying, yeah, the temple is going to be destroyed, and his followers' heads all collectively explode because they can't imagine how God would destroy the temple, even though he's done it once before. But in any case, they ask Jesus a follow-up question. When will this happen? And what will be the signs of the coming of the end of the age? Now, in Hebrew, there's this literary device called parallelism, where you say the same thing in two different ways in order to emphasize it. And I think what's happening here is the disciples are asking what they assume to be one question in two different ways, but Jesus gives them two different answers, as if to say, no, you're blurring these two things. You see the end of the temple and the end of the world as the same thing, and I'm trying to tell you they're not the same thing. Don't put your hope in the temple. And so Jesus goes through that whole business about persecutions and all this, and then says that when the abomination that causes desolation is erected in the temple, that you should get out. And he says that all of this is going to happen before this generation is gone. And that's what happens. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years later, the Romans surround and destroy Jerusalem and its temple. But then Jesus goes on to answer the second question that the disciples probably assumed was one and the same with the first one. Rather than one where he has a definite timeline, this time he doesn't. And so we pick up in Matthew 24, 36 to 44. He says, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, and not the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That's how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in a field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day the Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let the house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." And so the world will continue after the destruction of the temple, this event that seems unthinkable, that seems world-shattering to his disciples, is going to happen. But the day of the Lord is going to happen at another time. Now, of course, for us, this destruction of the temple is a 2,000-year-old bit of history, and the day of the Lord hasn't happened yet. And so we must live in a perpetual state of readiness. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we stockpile canned goods, batteries, toilet paper? No. This isn't the kind of thing you prepare for by laying up supplies. Rather, we stand watch and prepare for Jesus' return by living as people of the age to come and by patiently waiting for God to fulfill his promises. So, living as people of the age to come. The Old Testament prophets paint this picture of God's intention for humanity. They use the word shalom to describe it. We translate that as peace, but it means more than peace. It means completeness and fullness and flourishing and prosperity and justice and righteousness, all sort of rolled up into one under God's benevolent reign. That is what God hopes for us. And so as a community whose life together is meant to embody the life of the age to come, we should promote those things as best as we can by keeping the commandments. Now, not the weird commandments like, not being able to eat bacon or, having to wear tassels on your garments. But by and large, the law is meant to help shape the way that we live. The law often gets a bad rap. And the problem isn't the law itself, it's what we hope the law will do for us. If the law is meant to help us understand the kind of community that God is trying to call together, that's fine. If the law is something that we use to try and get ourselves saved, that's where we run into problems. Because what the law is trying to do is trying to put in very concrete terms what it looks like to be the kind of community in which shalom can take root. The kind of community that is based in love. And so Paul in Romans 13, 9 and 10 says this, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever commandment there may be, are summed up in this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. God wants us to be a community whose life together is characterized by love, because that brings about shalom. Now, we often hear about how God desires his people to be holy. Holiness means being set apart for God's purposes. God's purpose for the church is that the church's life together shows God's saving power. It shows the dynamics of the age that is to come, so that we will become a people whose life is an invitation to the world. And so we are called to a different kind of life. A life that is characterized by love, not by selfishness. Metaphorically, we're called to a community of light, and away from a community of darkness. So Paul continues, the night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to gratify the desires of your flesh. We show God's intention by becoming like Jesus, by humbly, and that's important, humbly living lives of love and goodness. The point isn't that we highlight our acts of piety to other people, but that we forget about ourselves and just get on with the business of pursuing the good of those around us. If we do this, we make God's power visible in our midst and attractive to the people around us. And so we are meant to live as people of the age to come. We can trust that God will fulfill his promises, but we can't trust in a specific timeline because God doesn't give us one. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a cottage industry, especially in American evangelicalism and its publishing wing, in cashing in on our desire to know when exactly that's going to happen. Perhaps you remember Edgar I don't know how to pronounce this guy's last name, Whisenant or something like that. He wrote a book, I think it was entitled 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Going to Come Back in 1988. Spoiler alert, in case you didn't notice, he didn't. And so he revised the book and to say he was going to come back in 1989, and then 1993, and then 1994. Or you might remember Harold Camping, who spent a lot of money on global ad campaigns saying that God was going to come back in October of 2011. Well, he didn't. Apparently, people like this can read the text so closely that they see patterns. They see a trail of breadcrumbs that God secretly put into the text that tells them exactly when he's going to come back. But they don't read the text closely enough to see what it's screaming at them. You won't know. You shouldn't know. I'm not telling you. So Jesus isn't saying, squint just right and turn your eyes and look at the page, and then you'll figure out what I was trying to say. Rather, all of this prediction is an exercise in missing the point. Jesus is saying, you won't know, you shouldn't know, so God's not going to tell you, ever. Jesus wants us to live with a sense of urgency that comes with the possibility that his return is imminent. In the book of Acts, we see the spread of the message of faith. It starts from a small community in Jerusalem. And very quickly, it spreads out into all of Judea and to Samaria and eventually to Rome, which, is sort of the center of the known world. So when Jesus says, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, we see the church do just that in a period of about 30 years. Do you think that that would have happened if Jesus had told them they had thousands of years to accomplish that goal? All right, it's 33 AD, and I'll see you in 2023. You've got 1,989 years. Hop to it. I remember when I was in university, and we got our syllabuses at the beginning of, I should say syllabi, I guess, syllabi at the beginning of each class, and it told you when all the assignments were going to be due, including those term papers. That was always the thing that stressed me out the most. All those term papers are going to land in the last 2 weeks of class. Do you think I could get started right away? No. I was a fairly conscientious student, and I really couldn't motivate myself to get started on my term papers until I was, 6 weeks into the semester. And so if it's that hard to keep motivated when there are weeks until a goal, how hard would it be to stay motivated if there are millennia before we're responsible for what we are doing? I'm glad that Jesus didn't tell them how much time they had. And I should be glad that he doesn't tell us when he will come back. Because it's really important for us to simply learn to be that group of people, not at the moment he's going to return, but just in our day-to-day life. It's important for us to remember that our hope is in God alone, not in a timetable, not in a flag, not in an institution, not in a charismatic personality, but just in God. Jesus tells his followers that the temple is going to be destroyed. That the temple is not the thing that they're meant to hope in, because it's not got a long part in God's grand plan. And so when the Roman army starts to surround Jerusalem, the Christians know that it's time to get out. And so they flee. And so they're largely spared from the horror of what happened when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. But the Jewish nationalists, their faith was not so much in God, but in their assumption about what God was going to do. And it must involve Jerusalem, and it must involve the temple, so they stayed to fight. And it was a disastrous defeat for them. Those are the kinds of things that happen when our hope is not in God, but in our expectations of God. And so let's live as the kind of people who trust in God with open hands, not understanding where he's leading us, what his time is going to be, but knowing that in the end he will prove himself to be faithful. God hasn't come back yet, but just because it's been 2,000 years doesn't mean it won't happen tomorrow. And just because it's been 2,000 years doesn't mean it couldn't possibly be 2,000 more years. Our job is not to discern when it's going to happen, but simply to live in this waiting time. To be God's people, no matter whether the end is imminent or a long way off. And so let's be faithful to that calling. Live our lives in the power of the Spirit as people of love and peace and shalom, so that if God happens to come back tomorrow, he'll be pleased with us when he sees what we've done.